You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C.
And I am your co-host, Katie Putz, coming to you also from Washington, D.C.
Hey, Katie, we're finally here at the end of the year. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. We made it.
We made it, yeah. And season's greetings, of course, to all of our subscribers and longstanding listeners. It's hard to believe, but the podcast is just a few months shy of 10 years. So I really want to just remark on that. We will officially do something for the 10-year anniversary, which will hit in February 2024. But Katie, I thought today would be good to do what we usually do on this podcast as the year comes to a close, which is look back at the year that's just gone by, reflect on some of the big trends, developments, events that really defined or had a meaningful effect on the course of geopolitics in Asia in 2023. So that's exactly what we're going to do. And so in preparing for this podcast, Katie and I kind of sat down and wrote down 8 specific things that we'll talk through. And we're not going to tell you what those 8 things are at the start of the episode, so you'll have to listen to go through our 8. These are 8 in no particular order, so don't think of this as a top 10 list where the first thing is the most important or anything like that. This is really just what you should be thinking of as we head into the new year. 2024, of course, I think is going to be a significant year in its own right, with many critical elections around the year, lots of questions around how many of the flashpoints that we regularly discuss on this podcast will evolve. But let's kick things off, Katie. I think the first one, and this is going to be familiar to listeners that just listened to our last episode, is really, I think, the topsy-turvy year, you might say, that it's been in U.S.-China ties. I mean, just a really big contrast between the first half of the year with the hot air balloon surveillance incident, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, canceling his trip to China, followed by the Sunnyside Summit in San Francisco between President Xi and Biden that's now resulted in a palpable reduction in tensions. I mean, there was a comment I just saw from a senior Indo-PACOM official noting that, aerial intercepts in the South China Sea have not been observed in the way that they were in the months leading up to that. So there's been a real kind of decompression there. But Katie, when you look back on the year in U.S.-China relations, what jumps out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what jumps out to me is the idea of a roller coaster, really. I mean, I think we started the very beginning of the year, with kind of modest hopes after the Bali summit in the previous November. And then it really tanked in February. Or was it February was Balloon Gate?
That's right, yeah.
With the whole balloon incident and the canceling of Blinken's trip, as you mentioned. And then the summer was a bit of a lull. And then we sort of saw this, I'm going to use this terrible word, a reset. There was a bit of a reset, I think. And we shall see, I think, going forward, if the roller coaster continues. I think, if anything, the sort of the Balloon Gate incident for is maybe unimportant as it might be in retrospect, really kind of blew up what was hoped to be building momentum towards a better relationship. And so I think we can't discount the possibility of another random thing kind of setting this off onto a different track. But I think there certainly is interest on both sides to sort of better that relationship. But I think certainly on the U.S. side in 2024, I think, is where some of that possible instability comes from as we kind of head into an election year in the United States, which I think everyone kind of expects to be a bit of a mess. And I don't think we can discount the possibility of China kind of getting pulled into that debate and that feeding into sort of diplomatic kerfuffles. What do you think, Ankit? What are you looking for in this relationship in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, the big question is, how long can compartmentalization last, right? I think, and when I say compartmentalization, I think what's been interesting is, despite the reset, I do think that's actually a pretty appropriate term to describe what's happened in the last 6 or so weeks. Despite this reset, the two countries, I think, acknowledge, are at least more willing to acknowledge than they were in the past, and especially on the Chinese side, that the competitive economic relationship in particular, and de-risking, decoupling, whatever you want to call it, is largely here to stay, even though China would prefer to be otherwise. Right? If we look back at 2023, I think in parallel to many of the geopolitical tensions over between the U.S. and China, we do see a steady drumbeat of steps by both countries to punish each other economically and sort of de-risk. I mean, for everything from kind of semiconductors, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce designating U.S. defense firms. So I think I'll be interested to see if that compartmentalization where the U.S. and China can continue to be, if not cooperative, at least communicative on things like military crisis communication can sort of coexist with this broader impulse in both countries right now to decouple, or at least continue that process of decoupling. And in China, I think, we discussed this when we talked about the Biden-Xi summit. It'll be interesting to see, if China is able to change its current economic trajectory, and if that will translate potentially to different behavior when it comes to the United States, right? There's this hypothesis that one of the reasons Xi Jinping in particular saw it fit to reciprocate the U.S. interest in resetting the relationship was due to internal difficulties in China, including economic difficulties, some of the mysterious leadership drama that we saw in 2023 that I think is certainly notable, right? The disappearance of the foreign minister, Qin Gang, the disappearance of the defense minister, Li Shangfu, and changes at the top levels of the rocket force. So we don't really see the full picture here of what's going on internally in China, but it may be the case that an externally more stable environment with the United States is desirable in this broader landscape. So I think that's kind of where I am on this first one that we noted on our list, right? Very unsurprisingly, the U.S.-China relationship, I think, continues to be the central fulcrum for this region when it comes to the big picture geopolitically.
And I think that presents a good segue to number 2 on our list, Ankit, which is the China-Philippines tension in the South China Sea. The South China Sea dispute has never really gone away, but I think it's fair to say that in 2023, it really returned to headlines in a big way with sort of successive incidents of Chinese vessels harassing, in particular, Philippine vessels. And so I'm curious, Ankit, what do you make of the developments in the South China Sea, and how should we fit them into that sort of wider geopolitical picture?
Yeah, so I think this one flows rather naturally from the discussion we just had on U.S.-China ties, because I do think that there is that subtext here of U.S. Article 4 commitments to the Philippines under the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, and sort of testing the applicability of that. And as we discussed on the recent episode that we did about this, the U.S. has actually made it rather explicit that attacks on Philippines armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft, including Coast Guard vessels in the South China Sea, would potentially invoke that article, resulting potentially in U.S. intervention. But I think from the Chinese side, this has really been more about the Philippines, right? So I think that's why, despite the fact that the reset between the U.S. and China happened, we have seen just in recent weeks, leading up to late November, early December, continued tensions, right? There was an incident just recently with where a Philippine resupply vessel heading to the Sierra Madre was disabled with water cannons that were used on that vessel by a Chinese maritime law enforcement ship. Just, I think, underscoring this continued effort at what you might call, gray zone coercion by China against the Philippines. Now, it's going to be interesting to see, I think, how this will take a turn or potentially not in 2014. I do think under President Marcos, the Philippines is re-emphasizing the South China Sea in a way that we really didn't see under Rodrigo Duterte, when both the Philippines' disposition towards the South China Sea and towards the United States were very different. So I think this does hold the potential to, again, emerge as a serious flashpoint. I think it still has that status right now. It's the most likely tinderbox in the current moment in the South China Sea. But of course, I think it's a good reminder that, these disputes continue to remain relevant. And unfortunately, the Philippines, despite gaining wide support internationally for the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling in favor of its maritime entitlement claims in the South China Sea, continues to struggle with China, which I think sees this kind of gray zone coercion as broadly useful to continue to assert China's claims and interest and to manipulate that risk in the South China Sea. And we have to also note here that while the U.S. is trying to communicate its resolve and reassure its treaty ally, right? I mean, you noted that we're heading into an election year. The U.S. is currently, beset with crises in the Middle East and Europe with the continuation of the Ukraine war, and so the appetite for a serious flare-up in the South China Sea, I don't necessarily think is in U.S. interest. So the U.S. will also be eager to keep the risk here pretty bounded, which I think is how we've seen Washington and the Philippines behave so far. So I'd expect that to continue here.
Yeah, and just one thing I want to note about this is, the sort of the Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, sort of harassing these Philippine vessels, is not necessarily new. But I think one thing that has changed is the way that Manila has sought to communicate and sort of be transparent about these incidents and publicize them. It's sort of uh, it doesn't necessarily change the fact that they're happening, because clearly they keep happening, but it does provide sort of a public record. And I think it does a bit of PR good for the Philippines to be sort of open about these incidents in a way that I think the previous Philippine administration sort of swept them under the rug in the interest of deepening the relationship with China. And so I think that will probably continue. And whether that is sort of part of an effort to deter the Chinese against sort of more serious actions, we'll have to see. But I thought that was worth sort of remarking on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's keep going through our list on this first episode. The next one that Katie and I identified is really the tensions that I think have emerged between the U.S., India, and Canada over India's alleged overseas extrajudicial assassination campaign against so-called Khalistani activists on Canadian and recently American soil. Right, that latter bit was something that came out after Katie and I initially discussed this on the podcast, focusing on the initial assassination of the Canadian Hardeep Singh Nijjar. So I think this one, Katie, for me is I think important in the sense that it underscores I think underscores a trend that we've been discussing on this podcast for a few years now about India, which is the extent to which the West and India and really the U.S. and India can identify their shared geopolitical interests, which are, I think, still very real, while at the same time coping with what is an increasingly divergent approach to values, right? And as we discussed on the podcast, there's also a lot of misunderstanding in both sides, in the U.S. about how India views the Khalistan issue as a core national security interest, and on the Indian side about why India, should face consequences for supporting extrajudicial assassination campaigns, despite the fact that this is something the U.S. and other countries do, right? I mean, leaving aside the differences between those particular cases. So it's been I think, an interesting moment, and I think it's certainly taken over a lot of the discourse on India in recent months. I think more so in Canada than the United States, but even in the U.S., I think there's been quite a bit of shock, particularly by the community of analysts and experts who don't necessarily focus too much on India, but maybe worry more broadly about states with authoritarian practices, states that don't respect human rights, resorting to extrajudicial means to deal with dissidents and critics overseas. So I think that's the context through which I see this. What about what's your take on this particular item?
Yeah, I mean, so we discussed a few months ago, the Canadian angle on this, the sort of announcement by Justin Trudeau in September of these allegations that the Indian government was involved in the killing of this Sikh separatist. I do think we should talk maybe just a little bit about the sort of update on that, which is in November, U.S. authorities charged an Indian national for an alleged murder for hire plot targeting a Sikh activist in the United States. And, the indictment stated that an unnamed Indian government agent was directing this plot. And so I think it will be interesting to see where that case goes. The individual who's alleged to have sort of done this was arrested in the Czech Republic during the summer and was extradited to the United States. And so I think that will be interesting to see how that court case progresses. But it is also kind of fascinating to me the sort of the Indian response to these two things felt a little bit different. The response
Yeah.
from New Delhi towards Canada after Justin Trudeau made these allegations went one direction, and I don't really remember hearing much about the Indian reaction to the November filing of charges. And so I think that is telling about sort of where India sort of stands between these two relationships. I think the Khalistani movement has been a sore point with Canada in particular because of its large Sikh population, and so I think it's something to watch, but it really does illustrate that sort of rift at the same time that we're trying to sort of deepen this relationship with India.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'd say here is, India heads into a general election in the first half of 2024, which I think raises the prospect that this could potentially turn into something domestically in India that becomes a point for the BJP, the ruling party, to potentially whip up some nationalism internally about how India is potentially being mistreated by Western countries. So something to keep an eye on. Already you do see some of that in domestic Indian commentary, and it's possible that could seep into the higher levels of the BJP party architecture heading into the general elections.
All right. Well, I think we're going to move now to the fourth thing on our list before we sort of break this episode off. And that is on the other end of Asia, Russia-North Korea ties. In September, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made a rare trip abroad to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who is not very popular these days in the Russian Far East. And, that was a meeting that I think was deeply concerning for U.S. allies in East Asia, Japan, and South Korea, for what sort of Russia can provide to North Korea, but also for Ukraine and Europe vis-a-vis what North Korea can provide to Russia. I think, and we did discuss this. This seems to be a thing. I like that we've summarized some of the greatest hits of the year with this list. But, I think when you look at this particular relationship, Ankit, what has happened since that meeting in September, and where are some of those concerns?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, we didn't rank this list, but I think if we had to rank this list, this one might be something I put at the top just in terms of the broader significance. I mean, in many ways for North Korea, I think this transformation in its relationship with Russia, which hasn't been a bad relationship by any means, but now I think it's just come to a different level. In many ways for Pyongyang, I think this is one of the best things that's happened geopolitically since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Right, I mean, we have some more data than when we discussed this on this podcast after the Putin-Kim meeting. And, the data is grim, right? The North Koreans are supplying not just artillery shells, but increasingly it appears like missile systems, wholesale missile systems to North Korea, although still some questions about what launchers, if any, that the North Koreans have been willing to transfer. Russia, for its part, has openly said that it no longer views the UN sanctions regime, a sanctions regime that it once supported, as relevant, given that was agreed in a completely different geopolitical world. And so this presents, I think, opportunities for both countries, right? Where I do kind of diverge with some of the analysis that's out there is that this is evidence of some kind of new authoritarian axis emerging where Russia and North Korea will bond over their shared grievances about the U.S. role in the world and the liberal international order and wreak havoc. I mean, I think some of what will follow as the consequence of this cooperation will be negative for that order, but I do think this is ultimately based on a transactional logic. I think one of the lessons we take away from just looking at the North Korean state and how North Korea approached the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War is that authoritarian countries of this kind, I don't think necessarily are prone to cooperate on the basis of shared values as much as we might think, in a way that's at least enduring. And so I think this is going to be much more pragmatic, much more transactional. And that's still bad news because there's a lot that transactionally Russia and North Korea can gain from each other in the short term. So the big question I have is, how to what extent will this cooperation actually accelerate and supercharge North Korea's ability to continue building up its nuclear capabilities and missile forces, right? Russia's openly, I think, suggested that there will be transfers of satellite technology to North Korea. South Korean intelligence suspects that the recent successful North Korean space launch benefited from Russian technology transfers. Should we expect to see technology transfer when it comes to other parts of North Korea's advanced defense and defense-related enterprises? And I think that's a real possibility. So a big one to, I think, keep an eye on heading into the new year. But yeah, I think for me, this is really, I think, at the top of my list in terms of the broader significance geopolitically.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would just to add sort of to your analysis of that is it's very opportunistic on both sides. And as you very clearly laid out, both North Korea and Russia see something that they can achieve with the other, and so they're going for it. We'll see if those dynamics change in 2024. I think a lot will hinge on how the war in Ukraine goes, because I think that is a big driver for Russia's interest in this relationship. But we don't really know what's going to happen next, so stay tuned.
All right. Well, Katie, we'll end our list of 8 there on number 4. For listeners, please do come back on the next episode to hear the final takeaways that Katie and I have from 2023. But for now, we'll leave it there. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not yet subscribed to the show, and do leave us your reviews anywhere you get your podcast. We really do appreciate that. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.